You're listening to Rogue Table Talks. Here's Mike.
Hello again. We are back. Rogue Table Talks, number 126. I think that's the number. I don't have it in front of me. 126. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it is 126.
126. We are here for you 126 times, and then plus, however many more of these we do. Yes, it is fall is falling, it seems. It'll be a cool, crisp day here in the
It's chilly,
the greater St. Louis area, but nice, sunny, and the kind of weather that there's still flowers in pots around the house, and they haven't been frozen out yet. But it's getting cooler. You can kind of feel the winter coming. That's kind of where we are. Something is ending and something is beginning, and it's a lovely time. How are you doing? How's the fam? It's all good.
Yeah, fam's doing well. We had a night with no activities last night, so we went over to the good old St. Louis Emos, had some Emos pizza, and
there you
watched
go.
a little bit of the Major League Championships, Dodgers and Braves, and just kind of relaxed. It was nice.
Fun. Yeah, fun times.
Yeah.
Fun times with the fam. We are talking about the book of Galatians and the gospel and all of that. We've been doing that for a number of weeks, and kind of wanted to dive into Galatians 4. And there's a few things that just kind of interest me in this passage. Obviously, we've been talking about the gospel and transformation of the gospel and so on. And so some of that will be expanded on. But there's a couple of new things in this passage that I think are interesting, that would be good for us to talk about and explore together. Passage is Galatians 4. I'm going to start in verse 3 and just go all the way to verse 20, because Paul is really just kind of pouring out his heart to these Galatians, related to their original reception of the gospel and all of the stuff that's happened since in some of them. So Galatians 4, starting in verse 3, in the same way we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent his Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you may make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you, my little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. So the context of this whole passage is, Paul went there. He says it's because of an ailment, and that's the original occasion of his being in Galatia. And they received the gospel with joy, and they loved him, and they adopted the gospel message, and everything seemed wonderful. And he's perplexed because they appear to be going back on it. And there's a few things in there that I think are worth talking about, and they stick out probably as things worth talking about. But also, I think that I think they have practical import for us. I think the first part is this elementary principles or depending on your translation, elementary spirits.
Mhm.
That formerly we were enslaved to the elementary principles or spirits of the world. But when Christ came to redeem us, we were set free and we were adopted into the family of God. And then later, why do you want to turn back again to these weak and worthless elementary principles or spirits whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons of years. And so, what is he talking about there? What is Paul talking about when he says elementary principles or elementary spirits of the world on the one hand to the son or daughter of God on the other hand? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm not exactly sure. I think there's another passage in Galatians, then we may get there, but or it may have been previously, the elementary spirits of the world do not handle, do not taste, do not touch.
Yes.
He just quotes someone there. But I think, so specifically, I'm not sure, but generally, I think we can say when he says you observe days and months and seasons and years, there is a form of religion that is really more like a magic formula. And it is, if I can do these certain things with these certain rituals at these certain times as some type of guarantee that God or the gods will provide for me, take care of me and my family. We won't have a sickness. We won't have any ailments. We won't die, or the harvest will come in. We won't be set back. And there's an element of certainty in there. But that's the kind of the backdrop of the whole Old Testament. What was countercultural between Yahweh and the ancient Near Eastern gods is you had to, quote unquote, feed the gods with your sacrifices to make sure that you lived a flourishing life. And Yahweh counters that with, no, I sacrifice on your behalf. I provide. This is what the ram in the thicket with Abraham. And so I think just in general, there's something to be said there. If that's the spirit of religion, and I don't mean that there's no religion within Christianity. I'm just meaning the worst case, the bad part of religion. Then yeah, there's something in our heart that longs for the guarantee and the certainty and the safety and security, and we try to go through our routines and our rituals to ensure that happens. But that's really a slavery. Is one of the things I think Paul is saying. Because we have to, quote unquote, feed God or the gods so that we are taken care of.
Yeah, and I think so. And the passage you're referring to is in Colossians 2.
Colossians.
Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual, this is verse 20. Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. And I love that passage because, obviously it bears directly on this passage in Galatians, and the same sort of thing is happening. Paul had been there, preached the gospel, there had been new life and growth, and then after he left, some people came, the Judaizers, and say, oh, that's great, but you also still have to keep the law. And it's this sense of all of these rules you want to return to. There's some attraction, as you said, in returning to those. Certainty, control, it seems too good to be true that I don't have to do this, so on and so on. But, as Paul says in Colossians, those rules lack any value, any power, they don't have any ability to transform you. The rules can't keep you from breaking the rules. In fact, as he says elsewhere in his writings, the rules sort of invite rule breaking. It's the nature of rules in our fallen state. And so that's this idea of a more primitive religion where we do stuff to appease the gods, is, that's what he's talking about. We were enslaved to that, and we've been set free from that. We've been adopted in the family because the Christ came to appease, the triune God. And why do we want to return to that? It seems to me in the salvific story of the Old Testament, the Exodus, the same thing happens. They are miraculously set free from slavery from Egypt, and all of the plagues, and what could never have happened. Pharaoh lets them go. They're on the shore of the Red Sea. They hear that Pharaoh's on his way there, and they're like, "Can't we go back? We're gonna die here. You brought us out here to die." They're in the desert. At least in Egypt, we had onions. When the food comes, and there's this sense of, can't we just go back to a world that it might not have been good, actually, but it was simple, or I understood it, or I felt like I was more in control. I mean, what do you think goes on there, and why is that in us, do you think? That sense of, let's go
Yeah.
back.
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, in one sense, I've lived it a couple of times recently with just moving. And in moving, you experience this transition of loss and finality and then newness. And I think that transition's always difficult, but major transitions are incredibly destabilizing. So if you can imagine, for generations, people grew up in Egypt and they didn't know what it was to be free. They were born slaves, so they got used to it, and adapted inside of that. And then here's this transition into, you don't live there anymore. It's not your identity. It's not your home. We're not going back. Like, there was a safety and security in being provided for because Egypt was wealthy. So it may have sucked, but at least we know we're getting paid,
Right.
and we got food and whatever. And so I think transition into the future, into the new, is always incredibly destabilizing. And so then you look back and you tend to idealize the past. Well, at least we had, whatever they said. At least we had leeks and onions and food, and we ate meat out of pots. And at least we had this, and at least we had that. And they fail to also say, but, our lifespan was short because we worked
Right.
7 days a week,
Right.
or we got beat when we stepped
Right.
out of line. And
Right.
so I think there's always that temptation, but really, to me, it's about comfort. And that may not be true for everyone, but it's about comfort in the known. Like, you knew what was expected, you knew how to live in that place, but now you're being invited into new birth, and new birth, it's the labor pains. It's painful. You're trying to make a new place for yourself, and the temptation is to go back into, even you think culturally, some Christians are fighting, we've got to go back. I don't know. I don't hear that a lot too much anymore. I think maybe people have recognized the score, but in the past 3 to 4 years, we have to go back as a nation. We have to go back to the good old days, or back to when Judeo-Christian values were at the center. And I'm not saying that there's not an element that was good in the country at that time, because it wasn't all bad, but it wasn't all good either. That's the past. I think we tend to look back and be like, oh, remember that, the good old days. But if you realize what you're living right now is the present, soon to be the past, you probably don't think these right now are the good old days.
Sure. Yeah.
Because the present's always somewhat disappointing.
Yeah.
And so the past is somewhat disappointing. You just tend to idealize it because it's comfortable and known. So I think there's part of that going on in this, transition of, this is new, and I love rules and security and certainty, and I don't know how to live in this place.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there in what you said. I think that, we could respond to and talk about, because it's really, it's really true. That's a phenomenon that when you look back at the past, you tend to look back from an uncertain present and an uncertain future and think, I wish things were more certain and stable. And in a sense, I think that's the heart of much of legalism is, I'm longing for some certainty where I know I can control where I stand. I'm going to keep these rules. I'll know who the good people are. And, all the nuance and all the shade of meaning that is in the real world, we're scared of that. And I think also, you said, going forward in this journey of transformation is uncertain. You're going to have to change. That's the very nature of transformation. That's what the word means. We talk about, we want to participate in transformation and the transformation of others. It's part of what we talk about at the vision of our church. And that, in a vision statement, it sounds great. In real life, what it means is I have to change. And that's not comfortable. It's not comfortable at all. It means I have to look honestly at myself, and I have to die to things, and I have to deny myself and pick up and all those things. All of that, in a way, it's harder than an imagined legalism. But the legalism actually can't do anything. It can't lead me to a life of transformation. It can't set me free. It can't adopt me into God's family. It's powerless. And so it is an illusion of something that seems pleasant to us for a moment, but it will only lead to despair. And that's what he says, in the middle of that passage. When you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. We're enslaved to these rules. It's enslaved to these elemental principles or spirits. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world whose slaves you want to be once more? And that is exactly what the people of Israel said. I want to go back and be slaves. And so what I want to talk about is composed or compared to trying to follow these principles, which in enslaving, in this part of that passage, Paul contrasts that with now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God. Like that's on one side, and the other side are these elementary principles. So what do you think of that sort of where he's comparing legalism, following the rules, all of that with knowing God, or rather being known by God? I don't exactly know what he meant. I think there's a lot there that we can think about. Like you can do one or you can do the other. This is the road, the transformation. This is your own journey to make yourself feel better or something. Like that's kind of what I'm getting. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there too. Let me start. I don't know if these answers are connected, but I've been tending to use this language lately, just in the conversations of leadership, and I think even in this conversation here, I'm preaching on Mark 7 this coming weekend, which fits nicely as a real life example when the Pharisees clean their hands ceremonially, and then they criticize Jesus' disciples because they're not ceremonially clean with their hands, and then they eat, and then their hands are defiled. And Jesus just quotes Isaiah and says, "You guys are hypocrites." And so these fit to me hand in glove. But this language of if you can get the right diagnosis, you can get the right prognosis. And one of the things that is going on in Mark 7 and related to here is if the diagnosis is I just need clean hands, then I'm going to wash my hands ceremonially before God and be clean. That would be the problem. But the problem is Jesus says, no, your hearts are defiled. So it's not a defilement of hands, it's a defilement of heart. And cleaning my hands doesn't necessarily, it can't clean my heart. And so this is Paul's version of that concept that Jesus is talking about. But me and my oldest daughter were talking about this yesterday. And I said the difference, or she said the difference between, the distinction you're drawing is these elementary principles of the world and then knowing and being known by God is the first one. You don't need a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have relationship. You're in a
Mm-hmm.
relationship to something that you've projected
Mm-hmm.
that will guarantee security. So it's your relationship to performance. You're not in a real live relationship with God or another person, and it's a one-way street. You don't need
Mm-hmm.
God or another person. You are the God,
Mm-hmm.
and but you're a cruel one because if you don't keep the rules and something goes wrong, you judge yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But this other idea, of knowing God and being known by God, well, let's say it this way: being in relationship with the living God, it's probably in some sense terrifying
Mm-hmm.
because I admit that He sees me and knows the inclinations of my heart, and not just in a sinful way, but in a desiring way. Like, who am I, and what do I long to do and be, and um, it's intimacy. And I
Mm-hmm.
think because of we live east of Eden and our defense mechanisms are most often up rather than down, then our first inclination is probably to reject intimacy
Mm-hmm.
for a much more controlled environment. And there's vulnerability there. Now God knows me and He invites me to know Him, but it's not just between me and God. It's now in this community where God knows me through other people and I know God through other people. And whew, that's just very risky.
Yeah. 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 That's really good. I think that is, I hadn't really thought about that comparison in that way. But yeah, Jesus has lots of language. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount basically is you hear these things, do this external or avoid this external thing. And I'm telling you, the real issue is in your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can't by action do anything transformative. It has to happen in your heart. That's where sin is. That's where your fallenness is. That's where transformation is. And actions flow out of that. And so it actually just, it reverses the whole equation because kind of what we're saying is if I practice the right things, I guess my heart will change at some point. And that's one of the things Paul says. It's just worthless. And he says that in Galatians. It has no value in doing that. And what Jesus is saying is if I transform your heart truly, eventually that transformation will flow outward and people will begin to see it in some way and you'll be salt and you'll be light in a way that you can't make happen in a way that flows out of this relationship that you have with God, with the living God. The Spirit of God is in you, transforming you, and you can have that, or you can just try to keep the rules. You
Mm-hmm.
can't do both. And the first one can transform you, and it's God transforming you and God changing your heart, and people seeing Christ in you because Christ is in you. And the second one is just a performance thing. And like you said, you don't really need a relationship with God if you're just keeping the rules. I mean, what, how is God helping you there? Yeah, you're trying to keep God happy. And there's some part of that where I think just the nature of our fallenness is this whole transformation and God, invading my heart and knowing everything. And that's scary.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
if it's true that I can just keep some rules, well, then I would prefer that. And, that's, and
Absolutely.
right. If I could just keep a few rules, that's obviously way better because I can just kind of be my own person, be in charge of my life. I keep some rules. And the tragedy is, I think there's a lot of people in the church that are trying to take that deal. And that's why these passages, the passage of Jesus and, transformation of your heart, the passage in Colossians, the passage here in Galatians, they're there for us because we can do the same thing where we can, it's not like we're going to go back to try to keep the Old Testament law, but an analogous thing is our behavior dictates who's good and who's bad. I know who I am, and I know other people based on their outward behavior, by their rule keeping, and so on and so on and so on. And there's just something about that that's super tempting, and that we want to keep falling back in. And without the transformation of the Spirit brings to our hearts, we will keep falling back in. For sure.
Absolutely. And I mean, even if it's not, I think it's tricky, and there's forms of self-deception here. So we have to really be ruthlessly honest with ourselves and ask for the Spirit to bring enlightenment here. But you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, and how do I do this? Maybe it's not, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't do that, that's maybe not a good starting place. The starting place is, okay, if this is such a strong thing that Jesus has to continually oppose it, it's evident in the New Testament letters, let's just don't pretend that we've risen above it. It's probably at work in us somewhere. So what is my magic formula? One way to say it is, what is my magic formula for controlling God? Or controlling my life? Is it my routine even? I'm not, you're saying, I'm not super religious. Okay, well, what's your routine? If you get out of, routine's the one thing we do because we think if we don't do it, bad things are going to happen. And when I get out of routine, I'm like, oh no, I didn't do my routine today. Something bad's going to happen. And what is it that we tend to try to control with our external behavior and environment?
How does this principle manifest itself in me? And what does that look like in me? And I'm probably blind to some of it. All right, one more thing. I kind of want to, one more little thing that, where he says, they make much of you, but for no good purpose. And that the sense is that these Judaizers are coming in and they're, by flattery, by whatever, that the Galatians are being manipulated, that they make much of you, but for no good purpose. And it seems like almost a culture war sort of, relationship where we recruit people to our side. And in doing so, we make our side more attractive. They make much of you, but for no good purpose. And it's a phrase that sort of fascinates me, especially in our present context where, there's this sense of we are the good people and come join us, come join our side, come join our team. And in the process, we'll oppose the bad people. I don't know. That phrase resonated with me in some way that seems to apply to our present moment. They make much of you, but for no good purpose, in the sense of being manipulated in a culture war sort of setting. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I tend to think, flattery lacks integrity. So, but the reason flattery is spoken against often, even in Proverbs, is because it works.
Yeah.
That's what Paul's saying. It works here.
Yeah.
They make much of you, but they're manipulating you, and part of you maybe likes it.
Yeah.
Like, hey, well, you build up my ego and you give me some affirmations, some strokes, that's great. And then what do I need to do to keep getting that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What isn't it the beginning of Galatians that Paul talks about people pleasing?
Yeah. Yeah.
If I was just here to please people, then about not here to please God. So maybe there's that, spirit dynamic at work here. But you could probably more accurately speak to the current culture war. But I do think there's Paul's frustrated because this flattery is causing you guys to be led astray.
Yeah, there's this, tying the two things together, we've been talking that the sense of make me feel good and give me some safe and secure box to live in, by rules and by flattery. By recruiting to our side, we define our side by this certain set of behaviors or rules, or even ascribing to a certain set of beliefs. And let's make our side feel good about being on our side. And, by contrast, that we know the other side doesn't deserve such flattery. And it is their sense of, it's a side taking, this dividing that is so prominent in our culture now, that we praise our side of the culture war uncritically, and we criticize the other side of the culture war uncritically. And in a sense, this sort of culture war can play out in our church between, people who are being transformed and people who are rule keeping. And in a sense, here the rule keepers are being recruited and reinforced and manipulated, as opposed to the people being transformed, who are the bad, the scary people, whatever. And again, I think there's some sense in which that is inflicted on us always. And sometimes there's a certain set of legalism that goes with political, cultural positions, that good people agree with me on X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and we might not say it, but by implication, the bad people don't. And that's another thing that appeals to us: the safety and security of the rules, the control the illusion of control that they appear to, and then this sense of side taking and reinforcing our side against the other side. All of that is stuff that we're all subject to in some way, right? Yeah. So I think that's another thing that we can ask ourselves: how is that happening in me? And against all of this, as we kind of begin to think about coming to a close, Paul is saying, compared to all of that, you're now children. You've been adopted into the family. You're known. You know God personally, or you're known by God personally. And that's the choice, to live as a child and an heir in the family of God, in relationship with God and the Spirit of God transforming you, or side taking, rule keeping, box defining world. And that second world, we have to admit to ourselves, is really attractive to us. And if we're not trying to avoid it, we'll tend to slide into it. And so that's part of the tension that we live in.
It's fear or love.
It's fear or love. That's a good way of just saying it.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
It's,
we're in a relationship.
Slave or
child, fear or love. Right. So we're in a transformative relationship of love and trust, or we're sort of slave, fear, rule keeping. And that's our choice. And so, we have to kind of remind ourselves through spiritual practices and such to choose the first one and avoid the second one. So with that, let's close this episode and remind us that for those who have come to know Christ, that we are children, we're heirs. The Spirit of his Son is in our hearts, transforming us so we can cry, Abba, Father. And that's the life that we're destined for. And so in that, grace and peace.
Thanks for listening to Rogue Table Talks. Be sure you're subscribed to our podcast wherever you listen and on our YouTube channel. Just search Rogue Table Talks.